Hello, Chris. All right, Geneva, I will pass it over to you.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, can everyone see my screen okay? Perfect. Okay, we'll get started then. So yeah, I'm Geneva Coulter. I'll be going through the presentation with you, really just focusing on implementation of the P's in the Becoming Pair Ready framework. So before I begin, I'll just respectfully acknowledge that I'm joining the presentation today from Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence this vibrant community. So just a bit about who I am to kind of give context for the presentation. So I'm Geneva Coulter. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Partnerships and Parasport Development Coordinator at the Stedward Center here in Edmonton. I've completed my bachelor's degree in kinesiology with a major in adaptive physical activity from the university. In my kind of other work life outside of the Stedward Center, I am the equipment manager with the Canadian Women's Para Hockey Team, which is also the team that I competed with from 2013 to 2018. And I have lived experience with disability. At this point in my life, I am ambulatory, using a cane as needed. And so just kind of all these things on the slide, just kind of wanted to highlight just because they all have relevance in how I go through this presentation and actually interact with the material. Yeah. So for today, I'll just do a really brief overview of the Becoming Para Ready framework, and then we'll get into the three main components, which are perspective, planning, and programming, going deeper into each P under each category to actually, really delve into those. So with that, the purpose of the session is to develop further understanding of the Becoming Para Ready resource, focusing on how to actually implement the Ps. So with those three components, perspective, planning, and programming, there are a variety of different Ps underneath each of those. All of those sections within the framework aren't just boxes to be checked. Once you go through philosophy ones, it's not a one and done sort of process. It's something to come back to and look at all of them again and again, and just because it's always something that can be improved as an individual as well as for your organization. So the Becoming Para Ready frame has a couple of specific principles that are throughout the entire framework. So the first is be proactive. So planning for inclusion and taking initiative to improve inclusion for your programs. Next is including the voices and choices of people experiencing disability. So really centering the disability community in the creation of inclusive programming. So that's including people with lived experience at all stages of your program development and delivery. Third is be reflective and purposeful in your actions. Your attitudes and behaviors set the tone for disability inclusion in your context. Next is disability is one facet of identity. So considering intersectionality, people experiencing disability have diverse backgrounds, life experiences, and perspectives. And then our last principle is that disability is a social construct and impairment is experienced on a continuum. So people experience impairments that may seem very similar, but everyone experiences them differently. And then with kind of where we're at within the framework, we're in the more of that take action stage. So really focusing on actually implementing. Okay, and so we'll get into our three sections. So first we'll go through perspective, which will cover philosophy, people, and policy. So philosophy is really just understanding your views on disability, sport, and society. So from an implementation standpoint, this can look like doing research, on disability, learning about different models of disability. So specifically the medical model, and social relational models of disability. And I'll get into those on the next slide just to give a brief overview. Another piece is considering your own vision and values as they are associated with disability and just throughout your entire life. Another piece of that is considering your why. So why did you get involved in sport? Why are you still involved in sport? Yeah. And then another piece is considering how your view of disability affects how you coach within parasport. And then kind of a last implementation piece for philosophy before I get into a couple examples is to read and listen about disability. There's a lot of great podcasts, videos, books written by individuals experiencing disability. You can learn a lot. And so just for that brief overview of the models, the medical model really focuses in on disability within an individual, that it's the individual themselves that are the problem. The social model takes essentially society into consideration, seeing that society is disabling an individual. So as an example, if you have an individual that uses a wheelchair and a set of stairs, the medical model would see the individual using the wheelchair as the problem, whereas the social model would see the stairs as the actual problem. And then we have the social relational understanding of disability. So actually seeing how social conditions influence individuals with disabilities, but that functional limitations are real. And so kind of taking into account the benefits from those first two models and tying them together to understand that there's aspects of society that are disabling individuals, but that there are aspects of disability that are physical and can be tied to identity and different pieces. So just to kind of get into some examples for philosophy, on the slide here, I've got my personal vision and values. Everything that's within that. So vision, like the vision is supporting communities to reach their chosen summits. And then values are community, experience, growth, inclusion, and asset. So for me, all of those pieces of the vision and values have ties to disability. It's an important part of my identity and my lived experience. And so it has ties throughout all of my life, including in sport. Thinking about your why, just some examples from other people that I've talked to, is leaving sport better than we found it, and to create an impact on people's quality of life so that together we can live a life worth living. And then just a couple individuals with lived experience who either have books or videos, but just some really great learning from them. I can send links to Kate later just to actually make sure that these are all available to everyone. Okay. Then we'll get into people. So inclusion can only be effective if everyone is on board with a common vision or understanding. So if we kind of look at that within philosophy as well as people, philosophy is really focused on your individual vision and values, whereas people can take into consideration more of what your organization is looking at. So what your organization's vision and values might be. So from an implementation standpoint, just thinking on a personal level, like, do your vision and values actually align with those of your organization? And do your organization's vision and values need to be updated? Kind of as an example of a way to kind of really incorporate inclusion within the organization is to actually keep inclusion as a standing agenda item for board meetings. This may be a way to talk about what you're currently doing, what you're not doing, what you'd like to be doing, what you see as opportunities, that sort of thing, but just keeping it at the forefront is something that needs to be considered. So just a couple examples. This is the vision and values of the Stedford Center. So our core values are embodied ways of knowing, so really focusing on lived experience with a impairment or disability, connection, collaboration, leadership, learning, and accessible. And then I also pulled, this was Canmore Nordic from their website, their vision and values, just that they're stating that they're inclusive and welcoming and accessible, and just that if someone were to read these vision and values, they'd, especially as an individual with a disability, they'd probably be willing to go and try the sport with them and reach out. Okay, and then our last P under perspective is policy. So developing policy around inclusion allows you to keep yourself accountable and for others to keep you accountable. A way of doing this is by writing a club inclusion commitment statement. So a club inclusion commitment statement is a public record that expresses the club's dedication to making sure its membership reflects the diversity of its local community. And it's a document that describes how the club values diversity and is committed to taking steps toward inclusion. So why actually have one? It tells your members or potential members that your organization is welcoming, accessible, and safe. It keeps everyone in the club accountable. It makes the organization more attractive to community organizations and sponsors. And it can make your organization more attractive for granting opportunities. So we're actually looking at that with pieces to include in the inclusion commitment statement. That can be defining what inclusion means, laying out key commitments, defining who you're seeking to include, defining how you'll go about things, showing how you're a part of a big picture, and linking to relevant policies. And then once developed, it's really important to actually share the commitment statement with your members, with potential members through your website, through social media, those sort of things. So just on the screen, we have a couple examples. The one on the right is from the Canadian Cerebral Palsy Sports Association. Their commitment statement is very policy based, and so it gets specific. Whereas the one on the left from USA Hockey, it's very general, it's very accessible, it's easy to find on the website and understand. And so then on the screen, we have a template for the club inclusion statement. This is a starting point. You don't, or you have to use it if it doesn't work for you, that sort of thing. Yeah, and I can share this one out later too. How are we doing so far? Any questions about this first 3 Ps? Anything specific about policy before we kind of move into our next section?
Looks like Chris is good and there's nothing in the comments.
Perfect. Okay, we'll keep going then. Okay, so we will get into planning. So that'll cover place, promotion, partnerships, price, and pathways. So within place, it's about considering your environment. So specifically looking at facilities, parking, and accommodations. So from an implementation standpoint, considering your environment, considering how your participants are getting to your facility, if public transit is an option, if there's accessible parking spots, if accessible parking spots are actually cleared of snow during the winter, that sort of thing, are walking routes cleared of snow, is the facility itself accessible, if there's stairs, or is there also a ramp or elevator, main entrances actually being accessible, or are accessible entrances kind of off to the side and not overly well marked. Are washrooms accessible? And is signage being provided in different options? This could look like Braille, large print, being in French as well as English, images if they're clear and relevant. Place can be a bit of a funny one because it's often not something that you actually have control over. And so if you don't actually have the potential to make changes, part of it is advocating for when there are changes to facility that they are being made more accessible, as well as supporting and informing current and new members in your club of the facility and potential barriers. So if, I'm not sure exactly, but basically just being aware of what your facility has to offer so that you can keep people aware of those things. And then there's a couple different resources that talk about different pieces of accessibility. So yeah. And so next we have promotion. So with all of your promotional materials being clear in who you are, what programs you have, how inclusive your programs are, and who you are marketing to. Okay, and then from an implementation standpoint, actually considering what information people need to know to get involved, thinking about where you're sharing your information and how you're sharing it, thinking about what you're offering and what coaching support you have available, thinking about if your coaches actually have experience with parasport or if it's a new experience for them as well, knowing what equipment you have available and marketing appropriately. So thinking if you just have skis and poles, or do you actually have set skis? And considering if your staff and volunteers are actually aware of being what's promoted so that if they get asked questions, they can promote it as well. So on the slide, I have an example of a poster from Nordic Alberta of a Try It Day that they did in partnership with Medicine Hat Adaptive. So for that Try It Day in Medicine Hat, they had sit skis available and they had skis available to rent. So on the poster, making sure that they had images of both options so that people would know what was available from that standpoint. And different age groups, having the junior session as well as the adult session. Yeah. And then there's also more resources for looking at inclusive communications and web accessibility. And so kind of within that promotion piece is really, really thinking about who you're looking to include in your club and knowing what you have available. So like I said, if you have sit skis available, promoting that so you can actually bring in new people to your club. And if you don't have sit skis, not promoting sit skiing, that sort of thing. And so yeah, there's the links for checking website accessibility, as well as working on your communications for language and terminology to be disability inclusive. Are there any specific questions around promotion before we keep going?
Pretty good from the chat site.
Okay. So partnerships. So creating your network. So that can be considering disability sport organizations, health and rehabilitation centers, parents and support workers. From an implementation standpoint, a lot of that is just sometimes finding the disability sport organizations. So if you're not sure of what's in your area, I've kind of put some keywords that you could try searching within your area. So things like disability, sport, parasport, adaptive, adapted, your location, wheelchair sports, specifically Nordic, potentially, those sort of things. You may or may not actually find things in your area. It really depends on where you're located, but it's a good way to start. Yeah. And then actually thinking about how you'll reach out to potential partners. So just some examples we have are like email, phone, in person, or through mutual contacts. So with email, it can be really easy to send an introductory email to a large list of contacts, not super personal, but you'll get it out there to a large base. Phone, as an option, it's more time consuming and more personal, but it can really provide that human connection and get people interested. In person, so things like conferences, they're easy to connect with people because everyone's kind of there for a similar purpose, often for networking and that education piece. And then through mutual contacts is another way. So if you know one person in an organization, then having them potentially send out information as well to get connected is a great way to go. It can go a long way to actually just have one person that already knows someone. And then kind of once you've made those connections with potential partners, suggest meeting to discuss how you could work together. And part of the meeting can be considering what benefits a partnership may bring for your organization as well as for the other. And so from a sports side of things that you would have to author to a disability sport organization, for example, is the sport expertise in cross-country skiing, potentially training facilities and coaches. And the disability sport organization would potentially bring in that disability specific knowledge as well as potential participants. Another option, looking beyond just disability sport organizations and those disability pieces specifically, is to also talk to other sport organizations that have had success in becoming more inclusive, whether that's other Nordic clubs or in other sports that you know have had success getting that inclusion piece. Just really learning what they've done and seeing how you could implement it as well. So next is price. So cost is often a barrier for many people experiencing disability. The cost of sport can be high, and for something that isn't required for daily living, it can often be hard to justify. Considering variable fee structures can make it easier to bring in individuals experiencing disability to your sport. From an implementation standpoint, talking to your PSO or your NSO about grant opportunities that may be sport specific can be a way to start. Another piece of that for price is also just building in a price for your Paranordic programs. It can be something very minor. It can be $10 to attend a session, but it kind of creates that buy-in with participants so that they understand that there is value for it. And it kind of makes them accountable to actually attend if they've already paid for something. And then tried events. They're a really good opportunity for individuals to try the sport before fully committing to something. With a sport like Nordic, if someone's interested in sit skiing, they're probably not going to buy a sit ski before they actually try the sport, just because they're expensive, and getting something a bit custom and making sure that it fits their body is really important. Tried events too often can be a really easy grant application to write. Grantors often really like to support initiatives that are bringing in a new population into a program. So some actual grant opportunities, looking at different organizations like the Canadian Paralympic Committee, they have the Paralympic Sport Development Fund. I've kind of got a couple that are specific to Alberta because that's the ones I know best. So through In Motion Network, Every Kid Can Play, and then some more general ones like Jumpstart with their community development grants. or CPRA with reaching each and every one, CIBC with championing inclusive communities. This is just a very short list of what I could kind of find on my own quick research, not going crazy in depth. But kind of similar to the finding disability organizations is you can kind of search keywords for finding grants as well. So looking at pieces like grassroots, community, sport, equipment, and then your location, that sort of thing. With grants, one thing to note is that depending on the grant, if there's age restrictions on it, if you're applying to support a program that's for parasport, age restrictions are often a bit different. So for example, with Jumpstart, it's generally a younger age group, I think like kids to young adult. But with parasport, when they're supporting parasport grants, they range the age. And so just kind of keeping that in mind is a good note to have. Okay, so we'll get into pathways. So pathways in parasport, while they can be considered similar to those in non-parasport, they take on different nuances. So a piece of that is that age is often less relevant in parasport, especially for following with the LTD. So for an athlete that has been experiencing disability from birth, they might just be following the LTD, same as their non-disabled peers. But for an individual that experiences disability later in life, their first involvement in parasport might be when they're 30 or 40 or later, depending. And so just kind of recognizing that age actually often isn't super relevant for parasport, especially just for getting involved, because you might have a 6-year-old that's starting and probably potentially skill level similar to a 20-year-old, depending on how recently they've been experiencing disability. With the pathways piece is really just talking to athletes about their goals. So if the interest is in high performance, working towards that. But if an athlete's actually just really interested in being active for life, not actually pushing for high performance, because pushing for something they don't want doesn't always keep them in the sport. And then classification's another piece for pathways. So from a participation standpoint, it's not the first step of participation. So actually just getting people into the sport to start, and then if they're interested in competing beyond a local level, classification can be considered to actually figure out how they're competing and what they're competing against, sort of thing. Okay, so then we're going to move into our last session of programming. Any questions? Are we good to keep going? Then we can kind of do questions at the end.
You're good to keep going. No questions in the chat yet.
Okay. Okay, so within programming, this will cover preference, participation, practice, and pedagogy. So with preference, this can be thinking about the inclusion spectrum. So considering if the programs that you're providing will be able to meet different points on that spectrum. So kind of as an example, with the first being no modifications, this could be an ambulatory skier using 2 poles. Doesn't look too different. Minor modifications could be an ambulatory skier using only 1 pole. Major modifications, this would be a sit skier. Primarily for people with a disability, would be getting into those competitions where classification is relevant. But also there's other sports that are a good example, like para hockey as well as wheelchair basketball. Non-playing roles, so looking at officials and referees. And then only for people with a disability, so sports like goalball and wheelchair rugby, or once you're actually at the Paralympics, and depending on the competitions. So from an implementation standpoint, just kind of really working with your athletes to develop and run programs that work for them. Each athlete will have preferences for what they prefer. And so then actually considering what you have capacity for in your organization. Considering if you actually have a coach that can focus specifically on para athletes, that's their one thing, or are they coaching para athletes within their other programs with non-para athletes? But just kind of recognizing what you can do and how you can work with athletes to kind of meet those preferences as well as your capacity. Participation focuses on quality parasport experiences being the driver behind all programming decisions. Every individual in your program will have different goals and needs, but considering the building blocks of belonging, autonomy, mastery, challenge, engagement, and meaning helps to build programs that last. So from that implementation standpoint, actually looking at those different building blocks. So with belonging, is the space actually physically accessible? Are athletes training with others of similar ages that they feel connected to? Autonomy, is there choice within training sessions? Are athletes listened to about what works well for them and their bodies? Mastery, are athletes given opportunity to develop their skills and feel successful? Challenge, are athletes given opportunities to test their skills? Are practices designed to work towards athletes' individual goals? Engagement, so are athletes involved in deciding what skills they want to work on? And then meaning, so does the sport have value for the athlete? That sort of thing, and making it matter to them. So really, that can be about providing the why and the relevance of something. For practice, reciprocal mentorship, working in collaboration with athletes is the cornerstone to coaching for parasport. So on the slide, we have 3 different practice adaptation frameworks. While the 3 frameworks use different words, they're all kind of focusing on the same things. I've kind of highlighted those by color within the frameworks. And so like within those adaptation frameworks is really just considering that balancing act of maximizing individual potential as well as keeping the integrity of the activity. So that really ties in with just keeping the purpose of the activity in mind. And so with teaching or coaching style, I'm just going to kind of go through the tree method, give a couple examples of different options. So teaching or coaching style, just thinking about different options for communicating, whether that's verbal, written, drawn, or demonstrated. With rules and regulations, this could be just changing rules to meet the needs of the moment, and considering what the purpose of the rule is and seeing if you can make an adaptation that maintains that purpose. Environment, just thinking about what can be changed in your environment. Just, are you actually training on newly added tracks or tracks a couple days old? Are you training in a group or one-on-one? And then equipment, so adjusting equipment to meet the needs of the athlete, whatever that looks like. And so just a bit more on reciprocal mentorship in parasport is just that generally coaches learn through informal mentorships in parasport. Coaches usually are lacking knowledge in 4 key areas: disability specific information, equipment, so sports wheelchairs and assistive devices, um, movement patterns, and then psychosocial knowledge, so interaction with the athlete and their worldview as a person with a disability. So really focusing on that reciprocal mentorship, so that you as the coach are teaching the athlete about the sport, but the athlete is also teaching you about disability and how their body works, so that you can both gain from that partnership. Okay, and then the last P we have is pedagogy, or approach to teaching. So athlete-centered coaching is critical when working with para-athletes to ensure you are co-creating practices and sport experiences in partnership with them. So that really ties into the reciprocal aspect of the practice development. And then a coach's approach to teaching should be focused on creating quality experiences through close athlete collaboration and the consideration of professional sport and disability knowledge. So from an implementation standpoint, that's working with the athletes to make practices that meet their needs. So thinking about the purpose of the practice, then working with your athletes to develop what it is, and asking your athletes what they think the practice should focus on and building the practice around that. But the big part of it is actually just working with your athletes, and being prepared to learn from your athletes as they are learning from you as well. Okay, that kind of gets us through the framework with those implementation pieces. We can kind of go through some questions if you have specific examples from your own organizations of things you've struggled with or things that have worked really well, and kind of go through that.
I'd actually just like to start with, I'm the newly appointed GM at Sovereign Lake, and what I'm seeing after not having had a lot of experience working with boards and strat funds and things like that is I see a lot of really inclusive wording in strategic plans, and then not throwing us under the bus as an organization, but what I have yet to see is the action on those things. And it concerns me when people go to read something and it says that it's inclusive and it's such a broad word. So now within that, and to get better at that, would you recommend the use of or anyone's used like an inclusive committee specifically, or having people on the already existing committees that are providing that perspective, instead of building a committee specifically for that? Because it's another committee, right? Which is fine as long as it's productive and useful. I don't know what a lot of other organizations have done.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it really depends on the organization on capacity for having another committee, but also like I think inclusion can really be something that's developed through everything. And so keeping it tied in throughout those other committees is really important. And if you can bring in individuals with lived experience with disability into your boards, those sort of things, to actually have that perspective and really help you figure out whether you are actually inclusive and how you can be more inclusive, those sort of things.
Yeah, like someone specifically on like a program, I mean, not knowing what our committees are, but specifically on a programs committee, a health and safety, things like that, like a new lodge planning development, having someone on there to speak to those things is really important. Okay, yeah, because another committee, I don't know always.
Yeah, Geneva, I think one of your colleagues said it best at a seminar earlier in the spring, you know, nothing about us without us, right? So having people with those lived experiences to, you know, go through the facility and say, actually, yeah, this works, or no, this doesn't, or, you know, this would be really, really helpful. sometimes well-intentioned, but without the actual knowledge. But I agree, there's a lot of stuff written down in words, but in practice, it's you don't always see the evidence. So curious others' perspectives on this.
We seem to do okay with like kind of the try the sport aspect. It's creating something that is more than just, you know, 1 or 2 events in the winter for people to try it. Any tips on finding people to implement the programs? That's a stretch for all programs, finding people to run them, but we find it particularly hard where there's interest to try it, but commitment to running something on a regular basis winds up being the spot that we get stuck on.
Mm-hmm. And so, like, do you find that you generally, like, for the triad, you have coaches that are able to do the triad and then just not run the program fully?
Well, we partner with community groups that they wind up, they're kind of like a multi-sport organization that just promotes activity within the persons with disabilities community. And, you know, there's interest in it, but or interest from the community members to try the sport, maybe can't do it again, but it's finding kind of a leader to implement a program so that it can function.
Yeah. Yeah, that's always a bit of a tricky one. Like if you have one person in your organization that's really focused on para, it can be quite easy, but if no one's really necessarily willing to take that on, sometimes it can be providing a bit of an incentive, whether it's supporting them with further training, that sort of thing. Yeah, I'm not always sure about getting people actually to run programs. That can be quite tricky, especially if the interest to actually be in a program.
And then can we, because I mean, like in our cases, we have like coaches of each department, like a cross country or biathlon. And so finding someone to work within each of those to support a para athlete. And then those courses and guidance, does that come through Nordic Canada? Just sorry for my inexperience with this subject.
Sure, I would kind of echo Chris's thing. You know, we over the years we've seen lots of applications for triad events. It's the what if, the what comes after the retention piece. So having somebody to kind of lead the charge is actually pretty critical, because their brain is in that space, right? And they're not being pulled away with other programs. We do have some coaching courses coming up, and some resources. So, you know, one of my questions is, you know, as a province, a territory, as a club, like what are some of your barriers? What are some gaps that you guys have that as an NSO we can help support? Whether it's knowledge, resources, that kind of stuff. The PWAD grant has been opened up and is accepting applications. So there's opportunities there from a funding perspective, but you know, that's money going into you, and then, you know, do you just kind of figure it out for yourself? How can we support you better? From an NSO perspective, we want to make sure that clubs and provinces have a really solid foundation, and then that at that grassroots level, we're able to attract and retain athletes and coaches, so that people do feel welcomed, and that there are opportunities out there.
Yeah, and so for us, that could be the more established programs and things like Alpine, and figuring out kind of how they went about doing that. Just because we both have them right at our back doors for telemark. Well, it's a little bit further out your back door at Big White, but yeah, and reaching out to those people. It might not be within our sport, but
Yeah, and I think with like actually developing a program that is long lasting, apart from just a try it, is that there can be a fear from coaches in actually coaching parasport, just that there's worry that you don't know enough about disability, about the sport itself, those things. But if no one's doing it, it's not going to happen. And so a lot of the time, if the athletes are interested in the sport, they're willing to work with an inexperienced coach to learn together because they want to do the program. And so just actually letting coaches know that if they don't know right now, that's fine, and they'll learn, because it's important to have those programs.
You got some experienced folks on the call. Lauren, you had a comment?
Not being a very experienced person, but I have kind of been around for a few years, and but not something from Saskatchewan. So I'm from Saskatchewan. Something that I found as a challenge too is that it seems like I think our Nordic development has been pretty good, and like we have a lot of equipment, and there's a lot of history to Nordic sport, especially and Nordic in Saskatchewan. But I found, as coming in as a newer person, that sometimes it's all in separate organizations, and I think that that I would like to try to work with others and see what can we do to bring these things together, so that there's like one place where people can find information, and yeah, working to, just like what Nordic Canada is doing at a national level, working to bring those programs together so we have more connection between the the able-bodied streams and then the para stream. So that's something I'm interested in. I think that's what we could work on, because it is hard for I mean, often we've had in Saskatchewan some really amazing leaders who have done things, but they've been acting on their own in a way. And so how does anyone fill those shoes? And so what I'm thinking of is, how can we have a team of people that can together fill those shoes, and then they won't have to have as much responsibility on only them, and it's not only up to them, but yeah, it's a team approach. That's sort of what I'm hoping to have some discussions with other people in Saskatchewan about, and see what we can do in terms of like teaming up and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think even just like that building out of actual like contingency plans, so that as soon as one person leaves an organization, the organization doesn't fall from a parasite of things. So like actually creating those options so that there's that mentorship, so that you have one really good para coach, but then bringing up others so that is that knowledge, and that it can stay within the community even if someone has to leave for a different reason. So yeah.
Can I ask another question, specifically about sit skis? I mean, we have a couple. We used to have someone that maintained them, but they're so individualized. So is there, I mean, in talking about, because we work with Chris Adaptive as well out of Kelowna, they have a certain amount, but we have like one that fits like 2 different people. So is there stuff that's adjustable? So if you're doing these demo days and we want to build that as a program, just as demo days alone, is there somewhere you guys could point us in the direction where that would be?
There's certainly a few out there. Couple different models. I've seen some stuff out of Quebec. John, you got some stuff recently in Ontario.
Yep.
It's a really good starting point, and that was one thing I always kind of struggled with the P1 grants, is somebody would apply for a sit ski, and to your point, Wendy, it would often, be functional for 1 or 2 people, and maybe not the people who showed up for your try it day. So then you're already creating a barrier to them experiencing the sport.
Wendy, it's John here. Canadian Tire Jumpstart was really helpful in getting us funds to purchase fully customizable sit skis. And I just found out today that the company has representation in the States now. So they are now distributing in the States, so you don't have to bring it in from Norway, which I had to.
What's the company again?
No, what was the company?
Sorry?
What was the company, John?
It's called Exero Tech adaptive sports equipment, and the manufacturer, they make the Spike snow ski, both in kneeling and seated positions, but they're fully customizable.
Okay, I'll dig around a little bit more. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Saskatchewan,
Sorry, Colette, go ahead.
sorry, Saskatchewan has a kneeler that is adjustable and is it's similar to the Spike, except it's more affordable and adjustable, I guess, sort of thing. But it is one piece of equipment that is really good. It's worked for an 8-year-old, and he's still in it now, and he's 13 or 14, and it works quite well for him.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's good to know when they have some range, especially for growing kids.
Even as athletes, you know, when they first get into a sit ski, what works as an introductory thing as they grow, get stronger, get more into the sport, their needs for people change as well. So to Geneva's point earlier, the price point on a sit ski is not cheap. So it can be a barrier for some. And I think, you know, as provinces or as a nation, sometimes there's a lot of sit skis just kind of gathering dust. So asking what's out there and what's available provincially or locally that you can kind of swap back and forth, right? I know Nordic Racers has quite a pool down in the Vancouver area. Any other burning questions?
One question I had was on Geneva, you had mentioned like books and podcasts and stuff. Was there a few resources you could recommend or maybe share them with us after?
Yeah, I can put together kind of a document with all of the links that I had in the presentation.
Awesome.
And I've made note of who's on the call so I can make sure that you guys, everybody gets it. Some updates from the Nordic Canada perspective. Like I said, the PWAD grant is open and accepting applications right now. Annual camp, some information just went out about that recently. That's happening November 17th to 19th in Canmore. There'll also be a CCI AWAD coaches course on the 15th and 16th. We've often tried to tie it in on the exact same weekend as the camp, but we often find we're extremely stretched in capacity, both for the coaching course and then to support the camp. So they're going to be two separate, but back to back. And then for some athletes who are on that competitive pathway and interested in internationally classified, there will be some races, some COC level races, but we will also have a time trial for those who are interested in just, you know, seeing where they're at, integrated with the camp. So those are some big things kind of happening right now, just as the season gets started, and some opportunities for coaches and athletes. Don't hesitate to reach out if you've got questions on stuff. The PWAD grant is much different this year, in that we are tying it to the Be Para Ready principles, and so to encourage clubs and provinces to really think about what they're doing, how they're doing it, and how we build a foundation across the country so that it is sustainable. And we've got really great programs supporting the growth of para in Canada. Any other questions before we wrap up? Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Geneva. I appreciate your time and experience being shared, and wonderful to see some new and familiar faces on the call. Don't hesitate to reach out if you got questions. We'll make sure that the information gets passed along to everybody. And yeah, thank you so much for your support. Exciting to have great people like you growing para in Canada.
Thank you so much. That was helpful.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Merci.
Thank you.